Your grandfather was offered $60,000 for his car last Tuesday. He said no. The buyer drove 3 hours, brought a cashier's check, was extremely polite about it. Still, no. The car hasn't moved since 2009. One headlight is basically a philosophical concept at this point. The tarp covering it is older than some marriages. And yet, no. You think it's stubbornness. His doctor thinks it's attachment issues. Dave, the buyer, thinks it's personal. They're all wrong. What's actually happening in that garage is one of the most quietly devastating psychological stories of the last 50 years, and it has nothing to do with the car. Let's talk about it. Here's something nobody tells you about the human brain. It doesn't store memories the way your phone stores photos. It doesn't just file things away neatly in folders labeled 1968 and good times. No, the brain encodes memories, and it encodes them with emotion as the ink. The stronger the emotion, the deeper the groove. And here's where it gets interesting. Psychologists have identified something called the reminiscence bump, a phenomenon where people remember events from roughly ages 15 to 25 with disproportionate clarity and emotional intensity compared to any other part of their lives. Why? Because that's when identity is being built. That's when the brain is essentially asking, who am I? What do I stand for? What does the world mean? Every experience during that window gets stamped with a kind of neurological priority tag. This matters. Remember this. This is you. Now, let's talk about what was happening in America between 1955 and 1975. Because if you were a young man growing up in that era, 16, 17, 18 years old, the world handed you something extraordinary. It handed you the automobile, not just as transportation, not just as a machine, but as a language, a way of saying, without words, exactly who you were and what you were capable of. A 1967 Pontiac GTO didn't just get you from point A to point B, it announced you, it declared you. The rumble of that engine wasn't noise, it was a statement. It said, I am here, I am powerful, I am free, and I am going somewhere. For an entire generation of young men, the car was the first thing they ever owned that felt like them. Not their parents' house, not their school uniform, not the job their father told them to take. Their car, their identity, their freedom. And the brain? The brain filed all of that under critical, do not delete. Now, here's where it gets even more layered. This wasn't just personal, this was cultural. Hollywood was feeding the machine. Bullitt, 1968, Steve McQueen, a Ford 390 GT, and 11 minutes of San Franciscan streets that made an entire generation physically incapable of being reasonable about cars. Vanishing Point, 1971. Two-Lane Blacktop, 1973. American Graffiti, 1973. The message was consistent, relentless, and deeply embedded. The car is freedom. The car is identity. The car is the American self. Television agreed. Advertising agreed. The entire post-war economic boom agreed. You want to understand why your grandfather won't sell that Chevelle? You have to understand that he didn't just buy a car. He bought into a mythology that told him at the most psychologically vulnerable and formative period of his entire life that this machine represents everything you are and everything you could become. That's not marketing, that's identity architecture. And here's the cruel twist. Just as that mythology was reaching its absolute peak, just as the muscle car era was hitting its most glorious, most ridiculous, most wonderful heights, the world pulled the rug out. Let's continue with the rupture. October 1973. OPEC oil embargo, gas lines around city blocks, prices quadrupling overnight, and then the cars changed. The 1974 models came out smaller, quieter, more sensible. Horsepower numbers dropped like a stock market crash. The muscle car era didn't fade gracefully. It didn't get a send-off. It got canceled. For the generation that had built their entire sense of self around those machines, this wasn't an inconvenience. This was a psychological rupture. Imagine the thing you used to define yourself, the thing that said, "This is who I am," suddenly declared obsolete. Not by your choice, by external forces, completely outside your control. Psychologists call this identity interruption. When a core symbol of the self is removed abruptly, the mind doesn't move on, it freezes at the moment of loss, creating what researchers call an unresolved identity anchor, a psychological attachment to the last version of the self that felt whole. That car under the tarp isn't a vehicle, it's a time capsule of a self the world stopped validating. He's not keeping it because he's irrational. He's keeping it because letting go of the car feels like letting go of himself. Why money doesn't work. You offer him money. Good money. Great money. He says no. And you think, does he not understand economics? Oh, he understands economics just fine. The problem is you're operating in a transactional framework, and he's operating in an existential one. When you say, "I'll give you $55,000, what he hears on a deep neurological level is, "I'll pay you to erase the last tangible proof that the best version of you ever existed." No amount of money compensates for that. Research backs this up. Extended self-theory, pioneered by consumer psychologist Russell Belk, shows that humans routinely incorporate objects into their sense of self. The object stops being something they own and becomes part of who they are. At that point, selling isn't a transaction, it's closer to amputation. And here's the layer nobody mentions. For many boomers, that classic car is one of the last anchors to a version of themselves that felt powerful, relevant, and seen. They've retired. Their culture has been replaced, reinterpreted, sometimes mocked. Their music is classic rock. Their era is now a historical period. But in that garage, they're still 19. The engine still runs. The world still makes sense. You want to take that and hand them a check. Of course they're saying no. Here's what drives me insane about how we talk about this. We call it stubbornness, irrationality, being difficult. We roll our eyes, make jokes at Thanksgiving, send passive-aggressive texts. "Dad won't sell the car again, LOL." And in doing so, we completely miss what's actually happening. We are watching a human being engage in one of the most sophisticated forms of psychological self-preservation available to the aging mind. Someone refusing to surrender their identity in a world that's given them very few other ways to maintain it. That's not stubbornness, that's dignity. And here's the uncomfortable mirror. Every single one of us has our version of the classic car, the thing we can't let go of, the thing that connects us to a version of ourselves we're terrified of losing, the thing that if someone offered to buy it, we'd look at them exactly the way your grandfather looks at Dave with his cashier's check. The only difference is that your grandfather's version has a 454 cubic inch engine and a tendency to leak oil on the driveway. So the next time you're standing in that driveway, looking at that car, feeling frustrated, stop. Don't see the rust. Don't see the impracticality. Don't see the money sitting there under a tarp. See a man who, at 17 years old, saved up for months, walked into a dealership, and drove away in something that made him feel, for the first time in his life, like he was exactly who he was supposed to be. See a man who watched the world change around him, sometimes beautifully, sometimes brutally, and held on to the one thing that still spoke his language. See a man who isn't refusing to sell a car, he's refusing to sell himself. And honestly, good for him.